We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're joined today by America's most syndicated columnist and prolific author, Cal Thomas, whose new book, A Watchman in the Night, explores half a century of news that is well worth devouring. But he joins us today to talk about the two-party system, that fount of endless frustration and in this constitutional republic. Cal, thanks ever so much for being here.
Thank you, Mark. And I'm intrigued by your use of the word devouring. Kind of gives a lot of people an upset stomach here, but I know what you mean.
Well, just as a brief aside, we did do a show on Cal's book, and it is fantastic. I do recommend everybody goes and gets and gives it a read. But just to give a very brief rundown on it, it sort of goes like, I like to compare it to Billy Joel's We Didn't Start the Fire, where it goes year by year through all the big stories and gives Cal's perspective. It's fascinating. It's a real zeitgeist capturer. So do go and get it. Or if you don't want to get a book yourself, go and borrow it off somebody. It's just worth reading. So, Cal,
or if you're in Los Angeles, just loot one of the stores.
I mean, that is, we're not recommending that on the show, but it is certainly the shopping preference of choice nowadays, right? Yeah. So, Cal, you wrote this article recently called The Founders Warned Us About Political Parties. And I found it fascinating and a very thought-provoking, which I got to be honest, is very rare. I read a lot of articles, but thought-provoking is rare to find, in my opinion. So can you give us a brief rundown of your main thrust with that?
Well, Mark, the founders understood human nature better than a lot of the preachers of their day, frankly. They had come from England, of course, where they saw certain benefits to the monarchy, but also certain detriments. And so they had lived a life under one form of government, and they sought to establish a different form without the downside of the government that they had left. George Washington, of course, who is regarded as the founding father, the ultimate founding father of the United States, had some incredible things to say. And I've looked them up and just listen to this and compare it with what is happening now. These men were like biblical prophets of old who foretold the future and warned people what could happen if they followed certain paths. In this case, political parties and division. Check this out. From Washington's perspective and judgment, political parties eventually and gradually incline the minds of men to seek security in the absolute power of an individual, leading to despotism. He acknowledges the fact that parties are sometimes beneficial in promoting liberty in monarchies, but he argues that political parties must be restrained in a popularly elected government because of their tendency to distract the government from their duties, create unfounded jealousies among groups and regions, raise false alarms among the people, promote riots and insurrection, and provide foreign nations and interests access to the government where they can impose their will upon the country. I rest my case. That is the front page of every newspaper in America.
This is it's from 2020 onwards, isn't it? With this promoting of the riots, I'm using the finger quote things here, the summer of love. That we had, and it's who was it Cassandra who was would always speak the truth but doomed for nobody to believe her, and it seems that George Washington was the founding Cassandra.
Right. Well, here's the thing, Mark, and this is the dirty little secret, and it's not just reserved to the United States, but it is certainly, I think, endemic to the United States. Everybody knows the solutions to the problems that confront us, whether it be the $32 trillion debt or the open border or just, you name it, Social Security, Medicare reform. Everybody acknowledges that's a problem. But in Washington and among the politicians, if you fix a problem, you lose the issue. Now, how cynical is that? Can you imagine that working in the medical community? Yes, I see this patient has a bad disease, but I'm not going to operate because I think that might hurt my funding for research. That's the kind of cynicism that has come about because of the division of our political parties. It hasn't always been this way. We've had, the classic example is Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, the House Speaker, who would argue like heck during the day about issues. And then O'Neill would go over to the White House and they'd have a couple of drinks and they'd settle the problem, whatever it was. But today, they don't do that. They don't even sit down with each other because in the age of cell phones, mobile phones, as you call them, you take a picture of somebody having dinner with a member of the opposition, they'll put it on their next fundraising letter and accuse the other person of treason or something. It's just crazy. So the debt grows, the border remains open, Social Security and Medicare continue to spin to the ultimate demise if something isn't done to reform them. And it's just terrible. But this is what the political parties do.
Well, historically, we tend to say that, the presidents, they were in such and such a party. But it surprised me that despite the warnings that you pointed out in your article from the founders, and of course the George Washington quote that you've just given us here, but it amazed me how quickly after the nation's founding that these factions sort of split off. It's almost as though that there was no way to avoid going back to like the British system. I guess at the time it was the Tories and the Whigs.
Yeah.
So how could they have avoided that back then? I mean, now it seems impossible to extricate. But we will talk about the future in a moment, if we may. But
Well,
back then, how could they have
just
stopped it?
Yeah, but we're more than divided now just between parties, Republican and Democrat. We're divided within parties. And that's even worse. I mean, you've got even in the Democrat Party is pretty much secular progressive now, but they've got we're all identified by tribes and groups. And on the Republican side, you've got the economic Republicans and you've got the social conservative religious Republicans. And they're all divided within their same group. Some, let's take abortion, for example. Some are opposed to the procedure 100%. Others say, well, 15 weeks. Some say 6 months. Some say we shouldn't mess with it at all. On the Democrat side, you've got, uncontrolled abortion without anything, but the spending problem continues. I mean, that you can't cut anything in Washington. You can sometimes cut the rate of increase in spending, but that makes no sense in either because it continues to drive the debt. The politicians don't want to say no to anybody, and the media fuel this. So and they only do this for Republicans. If you got a Republican president or Republican Congress, and they try to get rid of a program that's outmoded, that costs too much, that isn't delivering what it promised to do, then they go to national parks and shut down the government. And oh no, people won't get their Social Security checks, and the politicians run for cover. It's the most dishonest and disheartening approach to government that I've ever seen, Mark.
It's funny you say about how at most they'll slow down the spending. It just reminded me of all the fanfare over the latest inflation figures, and without going too deep, but they're saying, look, we've cut inflation in half. That doesn't mean that things aren't getting more expensive. It just means they're getting more expensive at a slightly lower rate.
Exactly. Well, petrol prices in America have gone back up again. In California, over $5 a gallon, and of course, Biden recently was touting his Bidenomics, that how great things are. Well, people aren't feeling it when they go to the grocery store. They're not feeling it when they fill up their cars. They're not feeling it. The mortgage rates are now up to 8%. 8%. They were during the Trump administration, I think they were just under 3%. So all of the figures point in the other direction. But this is a problem of politicians not abiding by the Constitution. The founders gave us a wonderful document for controlling government and giving the maximum amount of liberty to the people. Now it's been reversed. Government controls us. Virtually every agency of government has SWAT teams now, including the Department of Education, the Department of agriculture. Why do these departments need guns and protective gear and military weapons? What is going on with this country? The founders warned us against this, but we're not paying attention. They don't study the Constitution. People don't even know who their elected representatives are in many cases, and certainly not at the local level. You've seen these protests at school boards for the kind of stuff that's being taught. The answer, the solution is get them out of there. We don't send our troops to a foreign country to be trained, but we willingly send our children and grandchildren into these indoctrination camps that don't even study our founders.
You're preaching to the converted here, Cal. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.